All right, so George Washington, everyone knows the guy, right? I mean, face on the dollar bill, the general, the whole revolution thing.
Sure, but I bet you most people don't know the whole story. Like, did you know the guy basically taught himself everything?
Really? Yeah, no, you think like Virginia landowner, probably had tutors, went to fancy schools, all that.
Nope, not even close. Those fancy schools, like the ones in England, that was like the thing to do for rich colonists, right? But not Washington.
So how do you learn?
Dude was a bookworm. Seriously. Taught himself surveying, geography, military strategy, all that stuff from books.
Wow. Okay, so self-made guy, ambitious, driven to learn. You'd think military career, smooth sailing, right?
Nah. Actually, his early days in the military, kind of rough. French and Indian War, bunch of setbacks, defeats, the whole deal. Really tested him.
Oh, interesting. So that French and Indian War experience, I guess that really shaped him as a leader, huh?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's where he learned, not just brute force, but patience, think long-term, adapt. Crucial stuff for the revolution later on.
Okay, so then revolution time comes around. Was he like, yeah, let's break away from Britain right away?
No way. He actually struggled with it at first. I mean, he was a product of his time, believed in the system.
Yeah.
But as things got worse, he saw that fight for liberty. It was bigger than him, bigger than everyone.
So he had doubts, even when he became commander-in-chief leading the whole Continental Army.
Yeah, totally. Questioned himself, worried about the responsibility, but he still stepped up. I think that shows real commitment.
Makes you think, right? Like, what does it even mean to be a leader? Is it all ambition? Or is there something more to it?
Yeah, deep stuff. Maybe leadership isn't always about, wanting power, but more about doing what needs to be done, even when it's hard.
Speaking of hard, Valley Forge. I mean, come on. Brutal winter, not enough food, clothes freezing. That's got to be one of the worst situations for any leader, right?
Oh, yeah. Valley Forge, it was a crucible, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Tested Washington, tested the whole army. But here's the thing. In all that suffering, they found something.
What, like a hidden stash of food?
No. Like, they came together, shared suffering, trying to survive. It created this bond, this unity, became their strength.
So not just Washington's leadership, but the hardship itself kind of brought them together.
Exactly. And, maybe there's a lesson in that for all of us. Sometimes the toughest times, they can bring out the best in us,
Yeah.
That whole American spirit of resilience, never giving up. It all comes from moments like Valley Forge.
So we've talked about Valley Forge, this incredible example of resilience and leadership. But now we got to talk about something, well, tougher. Something that always comes up with Washington. Slavery.
Yeah, can't avoid it, right? It's part of his story, and a dark one. He inherited enslaved people, benefited from the system. No way around that.
But you mentioned earlier, like, his views maybe changed later on.
Yeah, towards the end of his life, you see this shift.
Mm.
Still owned enslaved people, but also started expressing doubts, discomfort.
So, like, internal conflict.
Exactly. And then, in his will, boom, huge decision.
What, like, gave away all his money?
No. He emancipated the enslaved people he owned. It was a big deal, especially back then. Not many people doing that.
Wow, okay. So trying to make things right in the end. It's tricky, though, judging historical figures, right? Like, accomplishments versus, well, their morals.
Totally. Washington, he's like a perfect example. Makes you think, how do we even reconcile those two sides? How do we judge the past honestly? It's a conversation we still have today about all sorts of historical figures.
Yeah, it's not just about statues and stuff. It's about understanding history, the good and the bad.
Right. And maybe learning from it too, right? Trying to be better.
Okay, so even with all that, Washington, he's still considered like this global icon, right? Leading a revolution, then stepping down. That's got to be rare, even today.
It was unheard of back then. Kings, emperors, they all clung to power. But Washington, he just walked away.
Yeah.
Twice, after the war, then after 2 terms as president.
Seriously, twice.
Yep. Set the precedent for a peaceful transfer of power. Showed the world that democracy, it could actually work. And that idea, man, it spread. Inspired revolutions, movements all over the place. People wanted that kind of freedom.
So he wasn't just fighting for America, he was fighting for an idea. And it caught on.
Big time. Shows you the power of ideas, right? How they can change the world, inspire people to fight for something better.
But even with all that success, those big ideas, I mean, leading a revolution, building a new nation, that takes a toll, right? Personal sacrifices, all that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He spent years away from Mount Vernon, his home, managing stuff from afar. His wealth, it went down because of it all. Plus, separation from loved ones, constant danger, the pressure of leading a whole country.
So what kept him going? through all that?
It seems like, well, belief.
Hmm.
He believed in what he was doing. That vision of America,
Mhm.
independent, free, that kept him going.
So not just ambition, but duty, service to something bigger.
Exactly. And that's a big part of his legacy, right? That idea of leadership as service, putting the needs of others before your own. Pretty powerful.
Okay, but once the fighting's over, you have this new nation, a bunch of former colonies. How do you even start to create a sense of unity? Like they were all so different.
That's where Washington's vision comes in. He knew to make it work, they needed something to bring them together, a shared identity, a sense of purpose.
So like what, speeches, rallies?
Kinda. He focused on symbols, stories, things like that,
Uh-huh.
promoted the American flag,
Yeah.
emphasized their common history, the fight for independence, stuff that binds people together.
So those symbols, those stories, they really matter, huh? Even today.
Absolutely. They give you a sense of belonging, right? A shared narrative. And for a nation like the U.S., so diverse that unity was essential.
So Washington, he's not just a general or president. He's like a nation builder.
Exactly. And that takes a lot of foresight, right? To see beyond the immediate challenges and think about the long-term future of the country.
All right, so nation building, check. But what about the rest of the world? I mean, back then, Europe was constantly at war. It must have been tempting to pick a side, get involved.
Oh, yeah, big time. But Washington, he was cautious. He saw how fragile the U.S. still was. Getting tangled up in those European wars, it could have destroyed everything they'd fought for.
So stay neutral. But that couldn't have been easy, right? Pressure from all sides.
Nope. But he stuck to it. Issued the neutrality proclamation basically saying U.S. stays out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that set the tone for American foreign policy for a long time.
Non-interventionism, avoiding alliances. We still debate that stuff today, right?
All the time. It's tricky balancing national interests with global involvement. That's the legacy of Washington's foreign policy.
We've talked about strategy, unity, diplomacy, but there's something else about Washington that stands out to me. His empathy. Like, that's not something you usually associate with powerful leaders, right?
True. But Washington, he had it. During the Revolution, he'd visit the troops, share their hardships, listen to their concerns, really connect with them.
So not just giving orders from a distance, but actually being there with them.
Exactly. And that earned him respect, loyalty. It's a lesson for all leaders, right? To understand the people you lead, connect with them on a human level.
Not just empathy, but also like humility. Washington, he never acted like he knew everything.
Yeah, super humble guy, admitted mistakes, reflected on his actions, always trying to improve. Not something you see a lot these days, is it?
Nope. So being willing to learn, to grow, even when you're in charge, that's important.
Absolutely. Washington, he showed that real strength isn't about holding on to power, but about constantly trying to be better.
And that idea of self-improvement, lifelong learning, it's something we can all take away from Washington's story, right? Like we can always be learning, growing, trying to be better versions of ourselves.
Totally. It's a journey, and Washington, he's a pretty good example of how to approach it.
So we've seen this humble side of Washington, but this is also the guy who basically walked away from, like, ultimate power, the presidency.
Right. It's kind of mind-blowing, right? I mean, most leaders, they'd kill to hold on to that kind of power.
Yeah.
But not Washington.
First, he resigns his military commission after the war, gives control back to Congress.
Yeah. Super important moment. Solidifies the whole civilian control of the military thing. No more kings and dictators calling the shots. It's the people, through their elected officials, who have the say.
And then he walks away from the presidency, too. Twice.
Right. Establishes that peaceful transfer of power. It's like, bam, a blueprint for democracy. And everyone's watching. It's a powerful message,
Okay, but then you've got all these political parties popping up. I bet that caused some headaches.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Yeah.
The Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, everyone fighting for their side. Washington, he hated it. Saw it as a threat to the whole idea of a united nation.
Didn't he warn about that in his farewell address? Like the dangers of political factions? Man, sounds familiar, right?
Oh, tell me about it. Today's political climate, it's like divided we fall. Washington, he was worried about that back then, and he was right.
So what'd he say we should do about it?
Well, he stressed the importance of dialogue, compromise, finding common ground even when you disagree. Basically, remember that we're all Americans, all in this together.
Easier said than done sometimes, right?
For sure. But it's worth striving for. If we want to keep this whole democracy thing going, we got to find ways to, actually listen to each other.
Okay, so we talked politics, but what about religion? I mean, this was a time when, religious tolerance wasn't exactly the norm.
Right. But Washington, he was different. A big believer in religious freedom. Everyone should be able to worship as they please, no questions asked.
He even wrote a letter to the Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island, assuring them that America was a place where they could practice their faith freely.
Exactly. It was a radical statement at the time. It basically set the stage for religious freedom as we know it today.
So, not just a military leader, not just a president, but also a champion of individual liberties. This guy was busy.
Uh-huh. Yeah, he wore a lot of hats.
Well, we've covered a lot about Washington. His leadership, his flaws, his victories, his vision for America. If you had to sum up his legacy in one word, what would it be?
That's tough. But I think foundation. He built the foundation for everything that America is today.
He set the bar high, right? For integrity, for leadership, for service to something bigger than yourself.
Exactly. It's like he created the blueprint for what it means to be an American leader.
Well, there you have it, folks. The story of George Washington. More than just the guy on the dollar bill, right? A complex figure full of contradictions, but ultimately a visionary leader who shaped the destiny of a nation.
And before we go, here's something to think about. We've talked about how Washington hated political divisions. So how do you think he'd feel about the state of things today? Could we learn something from his approach? Maybe find a way to bridge those divides, just like he did?
That's a good question to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of George Washington. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning from the past.